My book, Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle, makes the argument that we are the most illusioned nation on the planet, that we have become utterly disconnected from who we are, what we represent, and where we're going, and replaced it with fantasy. It has allowed us to run offshore penal colonies where we openly torture other human beings, suspend habeas corpus, engage in warrantless wiretapping and eavesdropping of American civilians, live through a Banana Republic 2000 election where, unfortunately, this state contributed to the theft of the Democratic vote, and yet describe ourselves as the greatest democracy on earth, a democracy that abrogates the right to impose its virtues on others by force. We have built a system of unfettered capitalism which has turned everything from human beings to the natural environment into commodities for exploitation until exhaustion or collapse. This has hollowed out America from the inside. It's why we are borrowing roughly at a rate of $2 billion a day from the Chinese and have been for the last 10 years. At some point, that has to collapse. We have destroyed our manufacturing base and described it as an opportunity for growth. All of these things have fed into, I think, a very frightening fantasy about where we're headed, that we have, in many ways, remained 40-year-old children, unable to confront as the historian, Harvard historian Charles Mayer calls it, that transition from an empire of production to an empire of consumption. Real wages in this country have remained stagnant since 1973, and just as we maintain empire through credit and borrowing, we maintain a lifestyle that we can no longer afford through credit and borrowing. All of that is collapsing. One strives towards a dream, one lives within an illusion. And the illusion that we are fed is that reality is never an impediment to what we want. That we can, if we just dig deep enough within ourselves, if we find our inner strength, if we grasp, as Tony Robbins says, that we are truly exceptional, if we believe that Jesus can perform miracles, if we focus on happiness, we can fulfill this pernicious psychological idea among consumer culture that has sort of instilled massive consumption as a kind of inner compulsion. And the danger of illusion is that it allows you to remain in a state of perpetual childishness, infantilism. And as that gap opens up between the illusion of who we are and the reality, the foreclosures, the bankruptcies that are caused by the inability to pay medical bills, the collapse of empire, we are unprepared emotionally, psychologically, and intellectually for what it is that is about to confront us. And when the wolf finally bays at the door, when our house is foreclosed, when the unemployment insurance runs out, then you react if you have remained in a state of illusion, as a child reacts. You search for a demagogue or a savior who promises moral renewal, vengeance, and new glory. And we can already see that very frightening psychological disease leaping up around the fringes of American society. The only way that one can speak about hope is to break free from a non-reality-based belief system, to begin to speak in a new language of humility, to accept a lifestyle which frees itself from profligate consumption and endorses a new simplicity. And finally, it is not incidental or accidental that the environmental crisis we face is twinned with the economic crisis. It stems from the same disease which is turning everything, human beings, into a commodity, the natural environment into a commodity that we exploit and exhaust until it dies. And either we wake from this illusion or we commit collective suicide.
Just 15 minutes ago, Chris was saying he had no idea what he was going to say up there.
Mr. Hedges, you really nail it right on the head with Empire of Illusion. It's exactly what is happening to this world today, in the grips of these monstrous money, these madmen that run this money system and capitalism and the militarization coming out of the Pentagon. But I would like to ask you, you speak of the spectacle, triumphs of spectacle. How have they gotten away with the September 11th supreme hoax, big lie? What do you think of the evidence of the crime of 9/11 and who was responsible for placing the explosives in those New York skyscrapers?
Let me deal with spectacle first, and then I'll deal with 9/11. It was interesting hearing Sam's analysis, some of which I agree with. I'm actually a fan of Eisenhower, and in political terms define myself as a conservative, in a sense that embracing Karl Popper's kind of piecemeal engineering, the deep distrust of utopianism. But I think Sam has confused something, and that is that we have shifted from conservatism, which in many ways was a positive force and is a positive force in democratic societies, to corporatism, and that's something very different. That the kind of penny capitalism that took place, I grew up in a farm town where farmers came in and sold their goods, even a regional capitalism where the guy of the in our local hardware store sat on the school board, that has been destroyed for corporate capitalism, which has radically upended our politics. And when you talk about Clinton, Clinton made a very conscious decision to take corporate money and do the bidding of corporate donors. He understood that if he did that, he could have fundraising parity with the Republicans, which he did by the 1990s, and of course now the Democrats get more. But to do the bidding of corporatism meant he accelerated what began in the Reagan administration, which wasn't conservatism, but a kind of coup d'etat in slow motion, in which the citizens were utterly disempowered to serve corporate interests. And that became justified through the utopian ideology of globalism, of free market capitalism, something Karl Polanyi in his great 1944 work, The Great Transformation, understood, that when a society loses the capacity for the sacred, when you build a system where human beings are discarded like human refuse, as we are seeing with our blue collar, and I come out of the blue collar, so it's something that has affected my own family, you build a kind of neo-feudalism. And that's where we're headed. So I think we have to make the distinction between conservatism and corporatism. And we live in a corporate state, as Sheldon Wolin in Democracy Incorporated, probably our greatest living political philosopher, has explained. Inverted totalitarianism, unlike classical totalitarianism, finds its expression in the anonymity of the corporate state, not in a demagogue, not in a charlatan, in a charismatic leader. It doesn't tear down a structure. It purports to cherish democracy, electoral politics, while subverting the levers of power. In classical totalitarianism, politics always trumps economics. In inverted totalitarianism, economics trumps politics with different kinds of ruthlessness. And I think that transformation, while we still use the language of traditional conservatism and the iconography of American patriotism, has masked something deeply insidious, which is why we are where we are. Now, just on 9/11, my friend Amy Goodman, unfortunately we get these questions all the time. I'm a denier in that sense. I don't think it was a conspiracy. I covered Al-Qaeda for the New York Times out of Paris, including huge investigations into Mohammed Atta. And I think the reason 9/11 worked is because Atta was brilliant and disciplined, obviously deeply psychotic, and without him it wouldn't have worked. Just to be fair to you, I also have not studied the structural analysis, and which some people have, who make that claim that this was orchestrated. But as someone who did spend a year of my life covering Al-Qaeda, it's my impression that it's more that the Bush administration was asleep at the switch and less that there was active involvement. I don't believe there was active involvement in the attacks of 9/11.
Next, please. For Mr. Hedges, Obama was against invading Iraq in 2002. He promised change in 2008. Once he was president, he appointed George Bush's Secretary of Defense to be Secretary of Defense, and now the American military presence in Iraq and Afghanistan is far greater than it was under George Bush. Please explain.
Because Obama's a brand. Obama, think of Obama the way, remember when Calvin Klein and Benetton associated risque style and HIV models and all this stuff to give their products an edge and a progressive appeal. But of course, the end result was the same, which is to make consumers confuse a brand with an experience. That is what Obama provided. He has, as you correctly point out, not veered from the policies endorsed, either financial or military, by the Bush administration. The kinds of arguments that occur between the Democrats and the Republicans are, as Freud says, essentially about the narcissism of minor difference. We see the rise of the corporatism, corporate state in every aspect, including the healthcare debate. Any factual discussion of healthcare in this country would begin with the acknowledgement that the for-profit healthcare industry is the problem and must be destroyed. This is an industry. This is an industry that has the legal right to hold sick children hostage while their parents bankrupt themselves to save their sons and daughters. And the inability to have a rational discussion around health care is driven because Obama, sadly, is largely a figurehead and has been emasculated by the corporate forces that have orchestrated the largest transference of wealth upwards in American history and are destroying a country that I love.
Another question for you, Chris.
Hey, these guys are feeling neglected.
I know, I feel, but I got to ask this. If you had been president in 2007 and your Treasury Secretary came to you and said, you got to come up with $250 million to save the financial industry, or there's going to be some kind of Armageddon, what would you have done?
The decision to commit $12.8 trillion in guarantees, loans, to a financial system dominated by speculators. And remember that in the 17th century, speculators were hung. Has empowered a criminal class that has not only trashed the global economy, but robbed small shareholders, many of whom are sitting in this room, who month after month put money aside for retirement and college and were wiped out. And those who wiped them out, figures like Richard Fuld from Lehman Brothers, walked away with $485 million in bonuses and compensation. Wall Street is run by a criminal class at this point. And most of them belong on trial, not subsidized in the most disgusting example of corporate welfare in human history. What is so myopic about what's happening is that corporatism is actually destroying the socialism that's trying to save it. A year from now, these corporations are not going to pump this kind of liquidity into the market, and we are going to be bereft of resources to respond to the growing desperation that is sweeping across the country. So, yeah, I think most of these people belong behind bars. Let me just quickly add something to that. Having spent 2 years writing a book on the Christian right, I spent a lot of time in these former manufacturing centers like Youngstown, and George is right. This bitterness, and much of my own family comes from former mill towns in Maine, utterly destroyed by NAFTA. NAFTA, 1994, passed by a Democratic administration, thrust a knife into the back of the American working class. It was a tremendous betrayal. And when you talk about blue-collar workers being angry at liberals and voting against their own interests, I think that's incorrect. Liberals betrayed the working class in this country, and the working class understood the vast hypocrisy on the part of a bankrupt liberal elite that continued to talk in the language of democracy and workers' rights, and year after year supported a Democratic Party that betrayed those rights, whether it was so-called welfare reform or the destruction of Glass-Steagall. And what we have done by allowing corporations to literally dismantle our manufacturing base is not only create a frightening kind of alienation and engender deep personal and economic among the working class, but permanently disenfranchise the working class. These jobs, at least the kinds of jobs that you had in mills and steel mills, they're not coming back. It's why you have people, struggling 2, 3, 4 jobs, taking jobs in Walmart where they're below the poverty line. And that disempowerment of the citizenry, that Weimarization of the American working class, is creating an oligarchic system. And you cannot sustain a functioning or a healthy democracy in an oligarchy, and that's something that even the ancient Greek writers on democracy like Plutarch and Thucydides understood. So I think that we are not seeing traditional conservatism. We are seeing something far more radical in the form of American corporatism. Well, it has no loyalty to America in terms of globalization and corporatism, which is literally hollowing out our country from the inside. And the rise of the corporate state has grave political consequences, as we saw in Italy and Germany in the early part of the 20th century.
And I just
Let this lady have her question.
yeah, oh yeah, go ahead.
First of all, most of my relatives at best finished high school. They can certainly understand this language, however infected I have been by Harvard. Second of all, we forgot Karl Popper's great dictum that the question is not how to get good people to rule. The question, because most people attracted to power are mediocre at best and often venal. The question is, how do we stop the powerful from doing as much damage as they can to us? And that becomes by building movements that frighten those in power. Sam talks about Nixon being the last liberal president, and he's right. But Richard Nixon, at his heart, was not a liberal. He was just frightened of movements, of the labor movement, of the civil rights movement, and of the anti-war movement. And all of the correctives in American democracy have not come from the top, including the New Deal. They came from movements. The suffragists, the Liberty Party that fought slavery, and the bankruptcy of American liberalism is that it became entranced by power. Our job, if you care about the working class in this country, is to build movements. Movements, as I used to live in France and saw, that frighten people in power, people like Richard Nixon, who did not have a moral bone in his body, to pass the Clean Water Act and support civil rights legislation. And that's been our failure. We have been seduced by a corporatized Democratic Party, and that has had terrifying consequences for our democracy.
We are, the greatest threat right now maybe to our democracy is the fact that the economic model that supported serious news gathering and, in my case, serious narrative journalism in the long form, it has collapsed, and no one has figured out how to replicate it on the web. So the first question is not, what can journalists do to improve? It's what can journalists do to stay in their jobs?
It's a cultural problem. We are shifting from a print-based society to an image-based society, something writers like Neil Postman wrote eloquently about, and that has terrifying consequences. We are a society utterly awash in lies, skillfully manipulated images that make us confuse how we are made to feel with knowledge. You talk about healthcare. Why do we fear universal healthcare, or why do some elements of the society fear it? Well, because we speak, talk, and think in the idiom of popular culture, which is about linguistically at about a 6th grade level. And the refusal to disconnect from these images and study issues outside of the jargon and cliches that are handed to us by one side or another has rendered us impotent. This is not a new phenomenon throughout history. Cicero wrote about it when he decried the spectacle of the Roman arena. And we are moving away from nuanced thought, from the struggle with ambiguity for this kind of childish cant that, as someone mentioned, Fox News, that dominates most of the cable news networks. And so when we watch the death of newspapers, Philadelphia Inquirer, San Francisco Chronicle, all in bankruptcy proceedings, the New York Times struggling, we are seeing the dying gasps of a culture that is severing itself from print and entering an age of terrifying illiteracy. There have been other periods in human history when populations have been illiterate, but no society has been able to replicate reality to such an extent that we confuse pseudo-events and images for reality itself. A third of the country is illiterate. 42 million Americans cannot read, and about 50 million Americans read at a 4th or 5th grade level. And then there are people who are functionally literate, but who don't read anymore. And that has political and social consequences that I think we are watching as we see the death of print. And I think George is right. A democracy that severs itself from the print-based world and from newspapers, which, for all of their flaws, and they have many, and their subservience to advertisers and commercialism, nevertheless hold entire cities' community, means that huge sections of America will, in essence, go dark. Nobody will be at City Hall. Nobody will be covering the police. And the ability for corruption and the abuse of power by our power elite will grow exponentially. What I fear is that we have the possibility of a deformed oligarchic system, which creates a neo-feudalistic state whereby at least 2/3 of Americans are kept through draconian control in a state of perpetual poverty. And that's what, these corporations are not going to go away unless they're made to go away. ExxonMobil is not going to allow energy independence. It would devastate their profits. Halliburton, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, tens of billions of dollars they take from taxpayers in weapons contracts. They're not going to ever give this up on their own.
We should debate what are the sources of poverty reduction in the world, that which is happening and that which is not happening. And now we're seeing the negative impacts of globalization in high-income countries, such as mine from the United States, and this has recent years contributed to political upheaval. But that globalization has been defended as if it were a great boost to billions of people throughout the world. So if we understand that this type of globalization has not benefited the majority of people in developing countries, and we understand that now there's a huge populist revolt because that same globalization model has not benefited the vast majority of people even in the developed countries, But at the same time, there's been a huge increase in wealth creation and a huge increase in trade and investment flows. Where is all the money going? Well, it turns out that we have the answer in this year's Trade and Development Report. It's going to the top 1% of superstar vampire corporations who are sucking even more wealth out of the vast majority of people around the world in the global north and the global south and everywhere in between.
Is poverty inevitable? The answer is no. We asked 2,000 people on what they thought was going on with poverty. We told them the 1990 number and asked them to guess where it had gone. And their guess was that it had fallen from that 36% down to 22%. In fact, the real line is far, far better. It drops all the way down to 9%. That means since 1990, 1.2 billion people have overcome extreme poverty. As the economist Max Roser has said, the newspapers could have run a headline, "Number of people in poverty fell by 137,000 since yesterday," every single day for 25 years, and been right. Real news. According to the World Bank, this extreme poverty definition we use is a cutoff of about $1.90 per day or less. Getting out of extreme poverty is not the end goal. We want people lifted up way beyond extreme poverty, but it's really the start that gets things going, that gets countries on the way to self-sufficiency and moving towards middle income. So this is not just about the individuals, it's also about the countries themselves.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street, and there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to riot. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value. So, I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. I want you to get up right now. Get up, go to your windows, open them, and stick your head out and yell, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. Things have got to change.
How many stations does this go out?
You've got to get mad.
67. I know it goes to Louisville and Atlanta.
I'm not going to take this anymore. Then we'll figure out what to do about the depression and the inflation and the oil crisis. But first, get up out of your chairs, open the window, stick your head out and yell, and say, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. Stick your head out of the window, open it, and stick your head out and keep yelling and yell, I'm as mad as hell, I'm not going to take this anymore. Just get up from your chairs right now. Go to the window.
Where are you going? I want to see if anybody's yelling.
Window, open it and stick your head out and yell and keep yelling. I'm mad as hell. I'm not going to take this anymore.
I'm mad as hell. I'm not going to take it anymore. I'm mad as hell. I'm not going to take it anymore.
I'm mad as hell.
gonna take it anymore! I'm not gonna take it anymore! I'm mad as hell! I'm mad as hell! I don't wanna take this anymore! I'm mad as hell! I'm mad as hell! I am mad as hell! I'm mad as hell! I'm mad as hell that I'm not going to take this! I am mad as hell! I'm not gonna take this anymore!
Augustine said that hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage.